So thanks everybody for joining us today. Here we're going to talk about a very hot topic, the hydrogen economy. We'll kind of get into a little bit of those details in a minute, so thank you for joining us. We'll start with a quick introduction of who we are. So my name is Spencer Hay. I've spent the better part of the last decade supporting various Suncor Energy business units across oil sands and others, and most recently have been supporting Suncor's low carbon fuels business as a commercial advisor. Trying to understand how we're intending to play in that space. And of course, I write for ENERGYminute every week, trying to deliver well-informed, balanced content for everybody, and we do what we can to make it entertaining as well. So that's a little bit about me. Griffin, how about yourself?
Yep, thanks, Spencer. So make a long story short, Griffin Smith, undergrad in geophysics, so spent some time in that world for a while. Got an MBA then after a bit of time and transitioned to the kind of innovation and tech side of the industry. Continue to write content for ENERGYminute along my path. And back to you, Spencer.
Perfect. So as we get started, we find that it's always really important to ground ourselves in a few foundational statements that we'll carry throughout the presentation. And so through the various reports that we read in preparation for this presentation, one quote really stuck out to us, which is just to give us an idea of scale. And this is from the International Energy Agency. Touch the drama in the statement, but again, it's a good summary. And the idea is that achieving net zero emissions by 2050 will require nothing short of the complete transformation of the global energy system. And so a little bit dramatic, but again, just to highlight how much work we have in front of us as professionals in the energy industry. So more importantly, as we kind of bring that down one level, is how does hydrogen fit into those 2050 net zero energy transition goals? And then thirdly, for a lot of those who are on the call today, how does Canada fit into 2050? And how is Canada positioned to be a leading hydrogen producer, or is Canada positioned to be a leader in this space? So we'll call those back as we go. Here's really the story we're looking to tell here today. We want to start with sort of the why of hydrogen. Why are we even talking about this? Why are we interested about it at all? Then we'll go into sort of a clarification about what we mean when we say hydrogen. You may have seen all sorts of statements and articles around blue hydrogen and green hydrogen and all these different colors. And so we're going to kind of clarify that a little bit, what that looks like. We'll talk about the how we're going to achieve these goals, what's in our way, and then when. And we're talking a little bit about the hydrogen economy more broadly, really around, is this a now thing? Are we ready to do this now? Are we aiming for 2030, 2050? What does that look like? And then, of course, we'll round out with, well, what does that mean for us? So that's really our story here today. So we're going to jump right in with why hydrogen and why now? Why are we even talking about this? And I think if you reflect on the idea that we've got these really aggressive or strong 2050 net zero goals, if that's our goal, what's our problem, right? Where are our emissions coming from today? And so the energy sector globally makes up some 70-80% of global carbon emissions. And so when you break down all of those sources, you find that they come from a few different places. They come from the electricity and heating that we need to heat our homes and heat our buildings and our infrastructure and all those things that we rely on every day. There's a really big section as well around our manufacturing sectors. So cement, steel, chemicals, all those things are very energy intensive. Transportation is a very popular one to talk about. Again, quite popular, but also very much a big source of emissions as we go through. And so those are the sort of three core areas of the energy emissions story. And when you look at those things, you find that not all of them can be electrified. You know, we talk about a lot of renewable energy, bring on wind and solar and nuclear and all these things to electrify our processes. But the idea is that not all of our emissions can be electrified. You know, when you think about chemicals, for example, use hydrogen as a physical component of their chemistry. And so you need hydrogen to make something like ammonia, which is used in fertilizer. when you think about things like steel manufacturing, the heat required to make steel is just not really something that you can do and produce using electricity, or not at least economically using electricity. You actually need a fuel source. And so who plays that fuel source? And so if we need molecules in addition to electrons, what are the good molecules? What are we trying to use? And I think the story with hydrogen is that once it's produced, and we'll get into production in a minute, is that it actually doesn't create greenhouse gas emissions when it's used to create energy, when it's combusted or used or combined with other sources. And so it really can be a net zero energy source. And again, caveat there, it depends on how it's produced, and we'll get into how it's produced in a bit. And then this third point, we've been making hydrogen for a really long time as a sort of a global industry. And so why are we talking about it now? I mean, this is old news. And I think the idea is that our ability to produce hydrogen cleanly, the technology required, the infrastructure required is starting to get to a point where it's becoming feasible, right? There, we actually are able to do it in a reasonably competitive way. And so we can actually produce it cleanly, and therefore when we combust it, it's also clean all the way through that life cycle. And so that's why it's important. So this is from the Hydrogen Strategy of Canada, which is a great read if you're looking for a new book to pick up on your nightstand. And this is how they frame it, is that hydrogen uniquely closes the gap in these hard to abate sectors, right? Energy intensive applications, long range transportation, high grade heat production, and again, feedstock and industrial processes. I'm sure there are petroleum engineers on this call who have worked in hydro treaters, and I bet you they would say that you can't add hydrogen to renewable or to fuels without actually having hydrogen. So again, it's really that solution for those hard to abate corners of our industry. And so that's the high level why, right? It's we've got this big emissions problem that we're trying to solve by 2050, and electricity and renewable energy can't do it all. It can do a lot of it, but it can't do it all. And so we should use a molecule that doesn't create greenhouse gas emissions to make up for it, right? And the technology is finally coming along to be able to enable us to do that. And so I'll pause there. I know Shantanu, I'm sure, has questions for us here, and then we'll get into the next section here.
Yeah, for sure. And that was really, very informative and a very cool perspective from, the hydrogen side of, why now. I guess related to the long range transportation, what in your kind of research and opinion is a better choice? Is hydrogen fuel or is it battery electric?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a very, very hot topic, as we look to change the way that we drive as passengers, but also just, all of those trucks that deliver groceries across the country, that deliver resources across the country. And the idea is that while battery electrics, or your Teslas of the world, are really well suited for passenger vehicles, your daily trips into work and all those sorts of things, the math doesn't really add up right now, or the technology doesn't add up right now when you get into long range transportation modes. And I'll cite sort of one report that I read from the University of California, Davis. They sort of did a study of, okay, if we wanted to use batteries for long range transportation, how big of a battery would it need to be? And what they found for an 800 kilometer trip, which is a pretty common long range trucking trip, you would need something like a 1400 kilowatt battery. It would weigh like 7 tons. And more importantly, or as importantly, it would reduce the payload of the truck by something like 30%. Because every battery you add, you have to take away space that you can transport with. And so for trucking, that doesn't make a lot of sense. They get paid for everything they're able to move. And so if you're taking up a third of your delivery with batteries that weigh more than the truck, it's probably not going to line up. Whereas hydrogen as a fuel, very similar to diesel now. I mean, you can create a fuel cell that makes the reaction happen, but the energy density of hydrogen is actually quite good, and you can combust it. And then the output is really water, right? When you add hydrogen and water together, hydrogen and oxygen together in a fuel cell, you have water coming out the end. And so those are some of the reasons why hydrogen is leaning towards that long range transportation solution.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I know, if trucks are filled with more batteries than packages, we're probably going to end up paying a little bit more for shipping then, which I'm sure nobody wants. But no,
Exactly.
thanks, Spencer. Maybe we'll move on to our next
Yeah,
topic there.
perfect. So we'll dive into the what, and this is it. So there's going to be a lot here. Bear with me. I'll try my best to condense some of this down. But there are a lot of different colors that I've seen in reports about the color of hydrogen. And my opinion is that anytime you've got really intelligent people pioneering an industry and they're first out there doing all this research, they do what they can to come up with confusing terminology so that it takes everybody else a little bit to catch up. But so you might have heard of a lot of different colors. I'm going to focus on the main five, in my opinion, anyways. Tell a bit of a story here. And so as it stands today, right now, if you look at some of the reports from Wood Mackenzie in particular, some 99% of the hydrogen that we make today is made using unabated fossil fuels that the waste gets, either vented or flared to atmosphere. And so that's your brown hydrogen, your gray hydrogen. You might have heard of black hydrogen as well. I'll get into what that means, but the idea is that we're producing hydrogen, but we're not doing it in a clean way. And of course, we want to be way over here. We want to be making blue, turquoise, green hydrogen is the ultimate goal. The idea with green hydrogen is you basically just take water and renewable energy and you zap the water with a whole bunch of power and you split out the molecules. And so you get hydrogen and oxygen. And so that's the best, that's the target, of course. But again, here's the problem. And we'll get into cost a little bit more in a minute. But it's relatively inexpensive to make fossil fuel hydrogen, as you can expect. And as you get closer and closer to green hydrogen, which is the ultimate goal, that net zero production becomes really expensive. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But so brown and gray hydrogen, just as a guide, you basically take a fossil fuel input, whether it be coal or whether it be natural gas, and you combust those fuels and you combine it usually with a steam, and there's a steam gas transfer that occurs. And what you end up with is the hydrogen splits out and then the carbon connects to the oxygen and creates CO2, carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. And then that is a waste stream that is then either vented or flared depending on the facility. And so heavy fossil fuel input, no capture or anything abatement on the back end. The sort of bridge technology, the one that seems most feasible today, is where you don't change that process. Still fossil fuel input. The difference is that you actually capture the carbon that comes out the end. You capture the waste stream that comes out of the end. Then you transport it and you store it and you sequester it underground. And so that's actually considered sort of net zero because there's no carbon emissions reaching the atmosphere. You're capturing all of them. Turquoise hydrogen is a really interesting one. It's combustion without the presence of oxygen. And so what you end up having, so still fossil fuel input, still natural gas, but you end up with hydrogen and solid carbon. So there's no carbon emissions. You actually have a carbon product. Now, I don't know how good or how high quality that carbon product will be. It's not carbon nanotubes coming out the other end, that's for sure. But certainly very interesting. Still quite experimental at this point. And then you have your ultimate goal, right? You've got green hydrogen is really what we want here, where you take water, and like I said, you take renewable electricity, you zap that water, and it splits the molecules out. So you get hydrogen and you get oxygen. And so that's really where we want to be able to get to. And so again, you might have heard of a lot of different colors, but largely they fall into these categories. Yellow hydrogen is green hydrogen, but with solar input only. You might have heard of pink and purple, which is nuclear. But again, it's focused on the process. It's really just electrolysis at the end of the day, different inputs. So a couple of other interesting notes, just what we actually need to make this happen. You've got green hydrogen, really just needs that low cost renewable energy. So in Canada, we're well positioned for that because we've got a very clean grid. We've got a lot of hydroelectricity, for example. Blue hydrogen is very geographic specific. And you'll find that that's why Alberta is a really popular place for blue hydrogen, because we actually have the geography to be able to store carbon underground effectively. So we'll get into that about how Alberta is potentially a global leader in blue hydrogen production. And then turquoise, it's really just a technology advancement piece, scale, cost, all that sort of stuff. So, we kind of talked about cost. We talked about these processes. I've left a little legend in the top corner there about these colors. But okay, Spencer said $1 sign over here, $3 signs over here. What does that actually mean? And here's really how it breaks down. The common unit is kilograms of hydrogen. And so we've kind of done that here. But as you can see right off the top, that gray, that brown, those unabated fossil fuel inputs are really the least expensive ways to produce hydrogen. I did run into a report that indicated some producers are making gray hydrogen at like $3 a kilogram. My recommendation to that company would be to not do that anymore. They would just stop that. It's really that $1, $2 space is where you need to be. And then of course you get into blue and green hydrogen. So blue hydrogen, when you think about the cost of it, is really gray hydrogen plus capture and transportation and storage. And so in a particular region, if they create gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen will always be more expensive because it's gray hydrogen technology plus capture and transportation and storage. And so a little bit more expensive, but if you do it right at the right scale, you can actually be very, very competitive. And then we go into green hydrogen, you see that huge bar of anywhere from $3 to $7.50 per kilo. I've seen numbers that are higher than that even. And that's just the state of the technology and the state of the scale and the state of renewable energy, how expensive it is, how much of it we can produce, all those sorts of things. So it's really important that we get there. We got a really long way to go. And then you'll see that, put a couple of Canadian flags in there. Canada is actually currently sitting at the lower end of those scales and will continue to, and really intends to. And so it's really well positioned to capture these markets. That blue hydrogen in Alberta, with enough scale, we can sequester the carbon. And in other provinces where we've got really green grids, Manitoba is some 95-ish% hydroelectric, BC, Quebec, all really clean grids. We can actually, really attack this green hydrogen space. And so to give you an idea of the relative cost of what do we need the price to be, so assuming $100 US carbon tax, it's really important. I'm going to pause here and just make a note that as it relates to carbon tax, it is an important part of making sure that hydrogen becomes viable and becomes competitive. And without it, right now, the technology just isn't there. And so there's a really big role for government to play in making and accelerating this industry here. So with 100 US ton carbon tax associated, you can actually start to abate and replace emissions from buses and trains quite quickly at that $5 space. Steel manufacturing can be abated in that $4.50 space. And then depending on whether you drive a Hummer or a Corolla, depends on when your vehicle emissions can be abated effectively. So you can see that we're actually potentially even competitive now. If we were to build the infrastructure at scale, then we could actually, as Canadians, be competitive and start replacing these emissions even today. So a lot of information there. I think the story is, right now we're producing hydrogen in a really unabated fossil fuel way, so like a sort of a dirtier way. And we have the technology today to get to a clean hydrogen production, particularly in Canada, if the technology is there. But there's a big role for government to play. There's a big role for private industry to play to get us there. But if we build that infrastructure, we really commit to it, we can actually start eliminating those emissions right now even. And so that's the what. I know there was a lot of information there. But Shantanu, I wonder if take a pause for a couple of questions that you may have for us before we get to the next section.
Yeah, you bet. And I think, just a lot of learning there, even on the different colors. I think you hear a lot of people saying them, but sometimes you're not quite sure what they exactly mean. So thanks again for running us through that.
Yeah.
I guess to add to that mix, I've heard there's a few other hydrogen colors such as pink, purple, and yellow. Would you be able to elaborate on what these are and how do they fit in with the other ones?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that the role that the intelligent pioneers in the hydrogen industry played is just to confuse the concepts, because they're all relatively the same. So like I said, in that fossil fuel space, might have heard of black hydrogen, and that's just coal gasification, just like brown hydrogen is, but they reclassified it because it's technically a different type of coal. So we'll let them have that one. In the yellow, pink space, purple space, it's all really, in my opinion anyways, in that green hydrogen bucket. They've recategorized colors to identify the actual renewable source, renewable energy source, but it's still the same. It's renewable energy plus water and electrolysis to split out your molecules. And so yellow is, I think, a play by the solar industry to give themselves their own category. It's solar power plus electrolysis and water. Pink and purple is nuclear. And I know nuclear is still a hot topic around how net zero it actually is. I think it's a clean energy source. And so pink and purple are different ways to talk about nuclear energy playing that renewable energy source plus water and electrolysis. So again, the processes are all the same. So when someone comes up a color, just have them clarify exactly what they're talking about, and you'll find that it's usually one of three things. It's fossil fuels, it's fossil fuels plus sequestration, or it's electrolysis of water.
Sounds good. Yeah. Maybe we'll just jump to the next section there with the path to hydrogen production and examples of some of the innovations there.
Yeah, absolutely. And then after this section, obviously you'll have heard enough from me. I'll pass it off to my colleague to round us out with the when and the why Canada. So what's in the way and how do we get there, right? We've talked about, let's recall back to our main statements, right? Around our problem or our goal is net zero, right? We want to be in the space where we are doing our part to clean up the atmosphere. And so understanding that goal, what's our problem? Our problem is these emissions, and this is where these emissions come from. And so you got to remember that when you look at all these emission sources, not everything can be electrified. Hydrogen can be, if we produce it, like I said, with green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, is a net zero energy source. That's really positive. It's a really, really useful molecule. And we're technologically ready to get there. So what else? What else do we need to worry about? And we highlight, there's a few more points than this, but we highlighted 5 key ones here, and they all play together. You really can't have one without the other. They all support each other to make this a reality. And I think the first one, and which to me is the most important, certainly, which is just around how government policy plays in the role of being able to mitigate capital risk to make clean hydrogen more competitive with other fuel sources, so competitive with diesel, competitive with gasoline, those sorts of things. And carbon tax could be an example of that, but other tax credits or funding sources would play into that. Because as you see, as we kind of talked about earlier, naturally, these new hydrogen, these clean hydrogen production processes are not naturally competitive with fossil fuel sources. And so you need sort of an artificial activity to rebalance that so that you can attract investment, so people can accelerate construction, and so we can build out the industry. It also ties into technology advancement and innovation, right? There are actually right now a lot of provincial and federal programs that are looking to invest in new hydrogen technology to get that cost down, to bring on turquoise, like those sorts of things. It's very important. And this third one, I think that the problem with green hydrogen right now is we underestimate how much renewable energy and electrolyzer capacity we actually need to make green hydrogen a reality. And for those who are on the call who subscribe to ENERGYminute, you might already know the answer to this because we talked about it yesterday in our newsletter. So quick plug to subscribe. You know the answer to this one already. Right now, the world has something like 0.5 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity in terms of power consumption. And on the books, there's a tons of investments, certainly. And we think that we can actually get to, if we were just to build all those projects, we'd get to something like 90 gigawatts. So from half a gigawatt to 90, that's quite a big jump. But when you look at the actual goal of net zero 2050, if we have to hit our milestones at 2030, we actually need 850 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity by 2030 and 3,600 gigawatts by 2050. So we're at half. We need to get, we've announced 90, we need to get to 850, and we need to get to 3,600. And so when you think about that from an investment standpoint and a technology standpoint, this needs to scale up incredibly fast if we want to meet these goals. It's a really big challenge. It's a cost challenge, it's a risk challenge, it's a technology challenge. This fourth piece is really around supply and demand creation and who goes first. And so I think if you were to finish this presentation, you were going away and be like, okay, I need to go buy a hydrogen vehicle because it's the future, and I'm going to go do that. I'm going to commit. I'm going to do my part to reduce emissions. I'm going to buy a hydrogen vehicle. And you go and you do that, comes off the lot, and you drive it home. You drive around for a bit, and then you think, okay, well, I better go fill it up. And the question is, where are you going to fill that car up? I don't certainly have a hydrogen fueling station anywhere near my house. I would imagine that you don't either. And so who goes first? Do you build the fueling stations? Do you build the demand side first? Do you build the supply side first? And what you're seeing in the market is there's actually big consortiums being built around trying to do it together. So you'll have producers, you'll have transporters, you'll have consumers and demand creators, and they're all coming together to build projects together so they can bring supply and demand on at the same time. So we got to accelerate that. We got to promote that collaboration to make this work. And then, of course, codes and standards. How do you blend it? How do you transport it? How do you store it? What are the issues? And again, in terms of effort, I think is probably the biggest piece. Achieving net zero emissions by 2050 will require nothing short of a complete transformation of the global energy system. So again, touch dramatic, but it kind of gives you the idea of the work that we have cut out for us here. I'm not gonna talk about all of these products or all of these examples, but there are a lot of companies doing a lot of really, really good things in this space to try to be that pioneer. And I'll maybe mention two just for now. And the first is that right in the middle, there's a Canadian flag. A really good Canadian story is Ballard Power. They're one of the largest hydrogen fuel cell producers in the world, and they're really targeting that heavy duty transportation, marine transportation, backup systems. And you may have actually seen recently, and if you haven't, take a look, Ballard Power has now agreed to sell CP Rail an additional 8 I think it's like 200 kilowatt fuel cells to go through sort of a rail pilot to see if we can decarbonize our rail systems, which I think is really, really, really good Canadian story. I think they're providing like 14 of them in total. And then a second one, honorable mention, this is a personal favorite of mine, is a company called Hybrid. They're sort of a consortium of Swedish organizations that have come together to make green steel. I think steel itself makes up some 6-7% of total carbon emissions, and they actually substituted coal and other fossil fuels and natural gas with green hydrogen, so hydrogen created with renewable energy, to make steel. They actually produced steel. They sold it to Volvo on a pilot basis, and I think they have a demonstration, so an industry scale facility they're looking to bring online this year. And so they're really, really trying hard to decarbonize steel already today. There's a lot of other great companies on this list as well. So that's the why, that's the what, that's the how. Shannon, I'll pass it back to you, and I'll actually hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Griffin Smith. He's going to take us through the next couple of sections here. So Shannon, Griffin, over to you.
Thanks for that, Spencer. Yeah, I think, in terms of how we think about hydrogen production and kind of the innovation that's going into this space, it's quite exciting to see the level of progress we've achieved. I guess, is there a particular portion of the hydrogen puzzle that needs more maturing in your kind of research there?
Yeah, maybe I'll hand that over to Griffin if he wants it. He's quite passionate about this space. I'll let him answer that for you.
Yeah, I can speak to it a bit here. I won't dive too deep into it because I think Spencer touched on it a lot there. But I think some of the challenges that we've kind of already highlighted a lot is cost, right? So how are we going to deal with the cost aspect? Some instances it's 5, 10x, right? So how do you really deal with that? And I mean, ultimately, what that means is the capital risk for companies to pursue these initiatives and take on these initiatives. So I think that's probably number one. I think right behind that comes into place is the infrastructure. It's kind of that chicken and the egg thing. Supply versus demand, what goes first, followed by what comes after. And if you don't have the infrastructure in place, you're not going to be able to get that demand. And then does the supply really make sense to produce, right? And I'll kind of just mention as a bit of a call out too that from a technology perspective, if we're shooting for that turquoise green kind of area in terms of hydrogen production, we are going to have to really lean on carbon capture technology to get us there. Essentially, if we're looking to basically kind of make that bridge transition and leverage our natural gas resources to kind of get us there into production of hydrogen, that carbon capture piece is going to be important to the puzzle.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of great challenges ahead for all the smart individuals kind of taking part and doing their part to, get over this hurdle. I guess we can move on to the last part of the presentation there with the when.
Perfect. Yeah, so I gave Spencer all the hard parts, so I'll talk about the easy parts, the fluffy future that we're already looking at. So as you can kind of see here, where we sit in 2022. So rough estimate of the market size, 130 billion USD. And the story to this point, and Spencer kind of touched on it, is as feedstock. So hydrogen's been leveraged for feedstock in chemicals, industry, and product production, essentially, right? So 95% so far has gone to that direction in that industry. In terms of future, so just kind of marked 2050 as maybe a place to look at. And again, this being fairly far in the future, I would advocate that this is by no means an absolute answer. Forecasts, as we know, can always dead on. So I'll advocate that this is more of a forecast based on some smarter individuals than myself. But I leaned on some resources, McKinsey and Government of Canada, some other areas to basically get an idea. But they're guesstimating a market size that's maybe about 5x is a conservative estimate, and then upwards from there is less conservative. So I've seen over $1 trillion essentially as some examples, but really what they're shooting for and what that breaks down into and how the product is used is they're kind of looking at almost like a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split in terms of the use of hydrogen itself. So that means 1/3 of it might go in to the fuel for transport, fuel for energy grids, fuel for just powering what we need. And then 1/3 would land in that heat for area. So heat for residential buildings, heat for industry, different substituting in for some current existing sources in those spaces. And then 1/3 will kind of still stick in that feedstock chemical products area. Now, the biggest challenge here is that price tag on the top right. So again, estimate, but 11 trillion capital investment is the guesstimate. So saying to get to this future state, it's going to cost a lot of money. And as I kind of highlighted just previously, there is a lot of risk and challenge that comes with that, given a lot of the things we see in the way right now in terms of infrastructure and in terms of having that demand to really make it make sense from a business perspective to pursue this, right? So, and I kind of noticed there that my my growth rate aspect is kind of chopped off, but currently, if we just do kind of that point measurement of going from any point in time, so using compound annual growth rate, just go from one point in time to another, we've basically seen a bit of about 5.4% growth rate for the industry in itself. All right, can jump to the next one, I believe. Yeah. So Shantanu, I think we might have 1 or 2 questions. Maybe we'll go with 1 question for that last slide potentially.
Yeah, you bet. I think in terms of thinking about this, there's a lot to the puzzle. And I think in terms of the areas we look at in the hydrogen economy, which one do you think has the most potential for growth?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think Spencer touched on it a lot. I think transportation really shows some high potential, and I think this actually might answer some of the questions that we might see at the end. But hydrogen is just an extremely light molecule, essentially, right? So it's extremely light, and it's actually, I think it's the highest. I mean, don't quote me if I'm wrong, but I'm going back to my university days, but it's the highest energy density fuel as well, fuel source. So basically the combination of something that's super light and that we can basically gain a lot of energy from, and that if we do it the right way, can produce zero emissions is very, very interesting and exciting, right? So I think transportation is the potential opportunity. The second one I would say is heating from like a building perspective. So we do have a lot of emissions that come from that area. So I think those two pieces being big portions of that initial screenshot that Spencer shared there in terms of our mission current state are both potential opportunities.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I guess now we'll move on a little bit, coming back to Canada and kind of the role we have to play.
Yeah, and so we wanted to kind of round this out a little bit of what does this mean to us? What does this mean to us from Canada perspective, and what does this mean from us as individuals? Currently, as it sits, China is a world leader in producing hydrogen, but again, it's from coal, essentially, right? So if we go back to Spencer's look there, it's more in that brown hydrogen perspective. And then if we look at the other side, it's Japan is probably one of the more advanced green hydrogen economies, basically leading from what they have in terms of infrastructure and how much they actually leverage and import and use. So it's kind of, those are two ends of the scale right now. So where does Canada fit in this, and what are the potential advantages that we have? I kind of want to actually, I read this recently and I just want to kind of reiterate it because it was an interesting point, but it was this opportunity that hydrogen has for us right now was likened to basically the LNG opportunity of a few years back. I think Canada had an opportunity to step into that space, given a lot of these advantages, and we actually didn't end up leading in that space. So there's the potential here that we're basically have the opportunity to maybe learn from previous experience. I know that there's all kinds of different factors that go into it. I just thought it was an interesting comparison. And really why? I mean, there's a kind of a list of a few things here, but I think number one that's most important, like from Canada's perspective, we have a lot of advantages from that natural resources side of the coin here, right? So we have hydroelectric capacity, we have nuclear energy capacity, we have a vast amount of fossil fuel storage, all of that good stuff, biomass, fresh water. I think I saw a question about this too, and I think generally speaking, and don't quote me, again, I'm going off of old knowledge here, but I think it takes about half fresh water in comparison to seawater to produce. So having fresh water basically gives you a 2-to-1 advantage. But yeah, so we have a lot of those natural resources pieces, and that really just helps a lot and gives us a big step up from that perspective. Second one there, the tech side of the world, Spencer touched on it. We already have established companies that are operating in this space. We have a lot of revenue being generated in this space. And the last thing I'll highlight, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but carbon capture technology, this is something that I think we are kind of we lead a little bit in this space. We know this stuff. We've done it before, which translates to that third point there, that energy sector. We know energy. We've been doing this for a long time. We understand this. So it's less of a starting from scratch for us. It's more of a pivot. We have the expertise. It's more just kind of pivoting our knowledge if we want to go this route. The other piece I'll add there is the collaborators piece. So we have kind of collaboration internally between government, industry, and academia. Historically, we do a good job of that, I think, here in our home country. I'll also mention international collaboration. Again, I wouldn't quote the time frame, but in the last year or so-ish, I've read up on different collaborations with Australia, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Japan, that we've taken from either a government perspective or a private sector tech perspective. So there is a lot of that happening, and we do have a history of kind of working collaboratively internally and externally. I'll add to the export market is a big advantage of ours as well. We've got these paths, these trade markets in place, and we've got this infrastructure in place to transfer a lot of this stuff, right? So Asia, Europe, US, all accessible from us, given our proximity, location, and size. And I would say it really does, again, give us that extra step, essentially, if this is an opportunity that Canada would like to pursue. We have those advantages. And then just jump over to and I believe this is our last slide, so I won't take too long and we can kind of get to some questions here. But when we said, what does this look like for us? So the hydrogen strategy of Canada has estimated the hydrogen could be up to 30% of Canada's future energy demand. If that's the case, where? Don't know yet, but there are some opportunities, essentially. Kind of looked at this from a people process technology perspective, if everyone's familiar with that's a little bit of a framework. But if we're talking about from a technology perspective, we're gonna be experiencing basically different technology in both the kind of heating and home and transportation industries. Those would be the two big pieces in terms of fuel for and heat for that was referenced on that previous slide there. We're gonna experience some technology pivots from those industries. From a career perspective, the estimates are potentially 340,000 jobs here in Canada. Again, just going off forecasting, which we always know is completely accurate, but it does show the potential, right? It does show that there is the potential out there. And then, as I kind of mentioned, this means more of a pivot for a lot of us, if that is something of interest and that is something that we want to do. We know a lot of this stuff already. We know energy production, transport, infrastructure, etc. So it's more of a pivot versus a learn from scratch or brand new a little bit here. So, and then the last thing is in our day-to-day, if there's changes to our daily process, quote unquote. So if we have to learn how to use a hydrogen fueling station, or if the cost of energy is going to change and all of that stuff. Spencer did a good job touching on it, but I'll kind of give maybe a bit more of a tangible example. But if we're talking about like Toyota already produces a hydrogen vehicle, let's say, for example, you were to go fill it up now, I think roughly it's about $16 per liter, quote unquote per liter for hydrogen. We're talking more like kilogram, but at that rate, and compare it to what you have, how many liters you have in your tank, that's an expensive tank of fuel, essentially, right? So that future state that they're shooting for in that $1 to $2 range, it's going to take a lot to get there, but if they can get there, that is the ultimate target state, and then the cost change for us isn't significant. But just for awareness of where we're currently at versus what current fuel costs are, kind of just to run that comparison, it's potentially going to be a change for us, potentially, right? So all good things to kind of consider when it comes to our experience in this future state. And I think that's our last bit here. So appreciate everyone taking the time, and yeah, absolutely. Always feel free to sign up for our regular newsletter for more, but I think at this point we'd probably start taking a few questions.
Yeah, and thank you again, Spencer and Griffin, for giving us a little bit of a background and also an understanding on kind of how complex the hydrogen economy really is, but kind of the leaps and advances that have been made in the past few years, and kind of where we're looking for in the future, as well as kind of Canada's role to play. Moving on to the audience question, I think we have quite a few, and then we have a few distinct themes where the questions are. So maybe we'll try and get in a few, being cognizant of time. We may not be able to address all the questions. So in the audience, you can feel free to reach out to us afterwards, and we can forward those questions on to our speakers later on. But just to begin with, one of the questions we have here in terms of the types of hydrogen, so maybe Spencer, if you want to touch on this one. Yeah. We had someone asking, with the emissions differences between blue and green, kind of what is really the emissions differences? If we're capturing the carbon, how is it different on an emission standpoint from green hydrogen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, they're not really that different. I mean, if you, like you said, if you're producing sort of gray hydrogen, but then you're capturing all the carbon, to me that calculates out as net zero. Green hydrogen, of course, there's no hydrogen or no carbon emissions to begin with. So I would think that both of them are really positive solutions. I think the debate right now, and I'm not sure that I align with this way of thinking. I think blue hydrogen is a very technically viable, cost-effective, clean way to make hydrogen. Some of the global community is talking about blue hydrogen as it's still connected to fossil fuels, right? It still uses fossil fuel inputs, and because of that, it's not as good as green hydrogen. My challenge to that is, if we're able to sequester it appropriately, it's still net zero, right? So it's still good. And secondly, blue hydrogen has an advantage in that it's way more affordable. So I was looking through the chat. I think some people were talking about, hey, like, what does this mean for consumers and how much we're paying for our heating bills if we're mixing the hydrogen into our natural gas systems and things like that. I think that for me, blue hydrogen can actually play a really positive role where you still get the emissions benefits of net zero hydrogen production, but you don't have to pay for it incredible amounts. And so the hope is that green hydrogen, the costs do come down, and do become more competitive. But until that happens, I still think blue hydrogen is a very, very good, I would say, net zero way to do it.
Sounds good. Yeah, I guess, in terms of hydrogen, a lot of people tend to also, and you guys touched on it quite a bit, the cost side. And when you compare it to kind of what we have today, when we're in this current economy where a lot of Canadians, 70% of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck, are there any, I think this person may be referring to maybe government incentives or programs in place to help kind of us, swallow that cost of, moving towards a greener future?
Yeah, I think what I'll caveat this is we don't have the answers right now to a lot of these questions. I think what we're intending to do is just kind of paint a picture of where we're currently at and what the price change or price difference is effectively right now. And if we're going to shoot for that future state, what we need to solve for. So I can't confidently say what is the right path. I think I think Spencer did a good job of just kind of visually showing the difference right now, and the kind of thought process or suggestion is that if we are able to have that support from that government perspective to either supplement the cost from a certain perspective or subsidize it in some way, shape, or form that makes it actually, I guess, swallowable, I think is the word to use. So again, not suggesting that we're going to expect to see a 5x hike in our energy costs in the near future, just kind of highlighting where we're currently at, essentially, versus where the goal is.
And I would maybe add a couple of quick things there too, which is that, even when you look at the transportation space, anybody who has owned or operated or worked for a long-range trucking organization, the margins can be very tight. And so the delivery of the hydrogen economy, or the task of the hydrogen economy, if you are proponents of it, is, okay, well, as a trucker, I may be willing to fill up with hydrogen. There's a lot of caveats there. Can I fill up? Is it going to mess up my route? But I'm not going to want to pay more than I'm paying for diesel already, right? Because my margins are razor thin as it is. I don't know if I can afford that. And so that's a really big challenge for the hydrogen economy that it needs to step up and deliver on. And I think there's still even, there's a really, really big question. And I'm certainly don't have all the answers here. Again, ENERGYminute subscribers might have seen some of this morning, but China has come out and said that, hey, we care about the energy transition, and we seriously, but we not at the expense of food security and energy security and sort of the livelihoods of our people. And that becomes a really, really intense sort of ethical debate around, what are the costs of clean economies versus sort of call it non-clean economies, and how does that impact the everyday person, right? I, for one, don't really want to give up my avocado toast, but maybe I need to. And so where do you fit on that spectrum kind of depends on your philosophy. It depends on what you want. But again, not at the expense of food security and energy security and just general livelihood. How do we do that? That's a really big challenge for the industry, for sure.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, people probably don't want to give up their livelihoods to necessarily be greener in their kind of the way they live their lives. But I think if we have a good mix of both somehow, that would be kind of the ideal state. We also had another question on a little bit of a comparison when we talked, when you guys mentioned, trucks can have batteries in them, but the more batteries that they have in them, the less cargo they can take. So we had an audience member that was asking, for heavy transport, why not mini LNG instead of hydrogen, which is lower in density and harder to handle?
I think Griffin really likes this one.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll do my best to answer part of it, and then correct me if you want to add anything to it, Spencer. It's a really good question, and it's kind of a matter of choice, right? So, if we're talking mini LNG, and apologies, I don't have a huge depth of knowledge in the area, but we're still talking emissions at that point to a certain extent, right? So that is part of the question or the equation that we got to factor into it, right? Additionally, I would say, and I kind of refer back to my chemistry chemistry from university, but given the how light hydrogen is essentially as a molecule and its energy density, there is the opportunity there that it kind of leads for a bit of an advantage. Again, I'll caveat that, say that there's probably a multitude of factors and comparisons you can kind of run between the two, but those are the two key points I believe that kind of stuck out in my mind when I heard that question.
Yeah, no, that's really good. There's going to be, again, we mentioned a lot of challenges, and that'll definitely be kind of one of the challenges that we do encounter, when we have alternatives. But yeah, it's kind of an advancing field and still not as mature as probably will be in the next kind of decade or two. We had another question in terms of preparing the workforce and the industry. Do you guys have any examples or anything you can point to of what Canada specifically is doing in that space for kind of transitioning to this hydrogen economy?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a couple examples of what companies are doing. I won't be able to give you the full story of how that workforce change happened, but a couple of examples that kind of pop up. I know that like I said, Ballard Fuel Cells. So they've been focusing on fuel cell technology. They're a Canadian company here, and how that basically translates and works. I'll give an example from that slide as well. That Linde, I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing it appropriately, but they've basically figured out how to store high purity hydrogen underground effectively, and use that as a storage facility to then lean on when they effectively need it, right? And then I think the other good example, there's actually and let me just make sure I capture the company right here in my notes, but I believe it was actually Air Products. Yeah, Air Products. In 2024, they're set to have a new hydrogen energy complex built in Edmonton, Alberta, which is effectively, I think, as they framed it, was going to be one of the largest hydrogen energy complex in Canada, I believe. Again, don't quote me, I'm going off of some of my notes here, but they've basically kind of started that project here internally in Canada. So those are just kind of a few examples of what these companies are doing. That specific skill set, I don't have the full details on what that means, but I think there is a lot of pivotable or overlap in the skill sets from our energy industry that can be leveraged in those situations.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit of color there too, Griffin, because I agree with you. I mean, I think that when you look at, let's say, the skills you are required to run a refinery, a lot of our Canadian refineries, for example, have steam methane reforming gray hydrogen production. And so those operators, those engineers that might be people on this call who work in hydro treating are really used to handling hydrogen in high volumes and high pressures. And so that's immediately transferable particularly if you're making blue hydrogen, because it's just a really big reformer. You've just got capture and storage assets tied to the back of it. And I think about all the geomechanical, geophysical capabilities we have in Canada for understanding what everything looks like underground and how we can, pull natural gas out, but how we can put carbon back in. I think obviously there's a skill to be built there, but I think it's really transferable, right? Drilling wells and managing gases, those sorts of things. We've built and managed today and for a long, long time, big mega projects with big industrial impacts. And so I think as professionals, whether you are using hydrogen as an ingredient, which I think doesn't really change the process, right? You're still making ammonia if you work in an ammonia factory or plant, you're still making fertilizer. You're just changing the fuel source a little bit, and it's a fuel source that we've been handling for a long time. Of course, it's not just that easy. Certainly, there's some challenges, but I really do think that as Canadians, particularly in Alberta, the skills that we have to make the products that we do today are very transferable over into the hydrogen economy as well.
Yeah, no, thank you both for providing kind of your perspectives there. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we won't be able to address any further questions today, but thank you to the audience as well for asking all these great questions. We will be posting this to our Facebook. Well, it's being live streamed there, and we'll also be posting it to our YouTube channel. So if you have anything you wanted to kind of review and go back on, feel free to check it out there. I'd like to thank you guys again and ENERGYminute for, having, putting all this together and bringing all these perspectives and kind of where we are today and where we're looking to go in the future. So really appreciate that. I know, our audience definitely appreciates kind of the knowledge you guys have shared today. And thank you again. And we hope to, potentially have you guys back for another talk on maybe in the future on hydrogen.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks, Jantanu. Thanks for having us. And if you found it interesting, don't forget to subscribe. There's a QR code there. We do deliver content. I told them I would say something like that, but you can also send us an email. We do read every email. So you can send us an email if you've got questions, and we can always talk about it then. So thank you, everybody.